Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Medieval Church History. I'm Teresa Holman, and with me is Father Michael Witt. Welcome, Father.
Thank you, Teresa.
Well, it is good to be back for another show. This is show 18.
18. We're moving right along.
We are. And we had a wonderful show last week with the Cluny monasteries and all of the reform that was begun from one little monastery.
One little monastery, yeah. And we're going to see really the fruits of this today. It's not going to be easy. The struggle's going to be there. But into another generation, the fruits of the foundation that was, I'm mixing my metaphors here, but the building of off of that foundation, and we're going to talk today about a pope who was a saint. Hadn't had one of those in centuries.
And, it was a rough road there.
Yeah, it's been a rough road. But we're going to have a pope who's a saint and is going to do tremendous reform of the church and is going to set the stage for yet another reforming pope saint who is going to have an ultimate confrontation, because ultimately what makes the Reformation possible is a mixture of holy monks, right, the Cluniac monks, and holy German emperors.
All right.
But there's going to come a German emperor who is not holy, and there's going to be a huge confrontation between the reforming popes and an emperor who wants to take things back to the good old days, or the bad old days, and that's a story down the line.
Okay.
But in the process, let's just continue savoring some of the Reformation.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So if you could show.
We're talking about the Emperor Saint Henry II,
Yes.
and his wife Saint Cunegunda, and how he saw that his placement as as emperor, and at the same time, remember, he was raised never with the intention of becoming a political figure. His education was geared toward religious life, really, and so he sees God's hand in his own life, pulling the two together so that he would be able to use his position as emperor to defend and to reform the church. And so that he does. It's not easy. In one case, he has a situation in which and in fact, interestingly enough, the Cluniac monks did not trust Henry.
Really?
Yeah, because as he's reforming the church in Germany, they're watching an emperor who's going in and actually deposing bishops.
Oh.
When there are bishops who are not worthy of their office, he actually puts them aside and elevates others. That's kind of, and at one point, the Archbishop of Mainz, the most important bishop in all of Germany, blocks the Cluniac reforms within Germany itself, and the monks are not able to reform some of the monasteries in Germany. And interestingly enough, you have the emperor come in, and he blocks the archbishop, so that the monks who have doubts about the emperor find themselves being helped by this emperor. Yeah, it's kind of fluid here. At one point, this Archbishop of Mainz, his name is Aribo, Archbishop Aribo of Mainz, actually publicly denies papal authority to overturn excommunications. Wow. He excommunicates somebody for some reason or another, and the Pope overcomes that excommunication, and Archbishop Aribo says, "You don't have any authority in my diocese to do that." Who steps in? The Emperor. So, sometimes his movement is heavy-handed, and yet at the same time, he uses that in order to defend the church and to support the church. There's a Pope Benedict the VII, who is trying to reform the clergy in Italy in his own diocese. And particularly, Benedict VII recognizes two things that are important for the reformation of the church in his own diocese. And one is to do away with simony, that buying and selling of church offices, and secondly, celibacy. He recognizes that too many priests are not living a celibate life, and you've got those country priests out there that are doing this stuff, and so he realizes that both of those have to be changed, and Saint Henry II supports Benedict in this and is attempting to help reform. Unfortunately, both of them died in 1024. They both died the same year. It's also the year that Hugh of Cluny is born in 1024. Okay. And remember, he becomes Saint Hugh of Cluny, this tremendous fellow. So what we're going to see is that when he becomes abbot, the year that he becomes abbot of Cluny, there are actually 60 Cluniac houses already.
Wow.
By the time he dies in 1109, so he has quite a long life himself, there are 2,000 abbeys.
Oh my gosh.
Isn't that wonderful?
That's tremendous.
Isn't it? Yeah. And every one of them is going to have an influence in that particular region toward the reform of the church. Wow. These monasteries are the fertile ground that are going to grow reformers in the church, and we'll see the lives of some of them then as we look at this episode in church history. Saint Henry, as I said, died in 1024. The next emperor is Conrad II of Speyer, and he's elected emperor. He'll spend about 15 years of his life as emperor just trying to assert the authority in his own empire. He unfortunately reigns at a time when people just decided to revolt, and so in Italy he's going to constantly have difficulties. Over in the eastern part of his kingdom, Boleslaw I of Second in Poland has a revolt against him. In Burgundy, he's going to be given Burgundy. Remember his, he's going to be bequeathed Burgundy, and he's going to have to spend some time there also. So Conrad II is not terribly engaged in Rome, and as a result of that, guess who comes back? But these Italian families, these Roman families. And one of those is going to be Benedict IX, the triple pope. Conrad dies in 1039. He is succeeded by yet another Henry. This is going to be King Henry III. He is also going to be one who's going to be engaged in church reform, and in many ways is even more involved than Henry II was. His nickname in history is Henry the Black. And I think it has to do with his sternness. He lived for being an emperor, he lived a very austere life. Fasted, did not dress in elegant clothing. He just lived a very stern, self-disciplinarian kind of a life, very ascetical, and had a very strong sense of duty. And particularly the sense of serving the church through the office of emperor.
Okay.
Here you have again that same sense that Henry II had, and his concept again was to reform the church. But he backs off from a position that Henry II had was he did not believe that the emperor had the authority to remove bad bishops.
Oh.
He did not believe that. He also believed that this could only be done through ecclesiastical tribunals. And the emperor could call these tribunals together, but they would have to do that. And always a bishop could only be placed as bishop with, of course, the apostolic mandate. So but keep that in mind because he's going to violate
his
own
belief.
rules. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. His first wife was from Denmark, and she died early. And he married again, and this time he married French. He married Agnes of Poitou, who happened to have been a devotee of the Cluniac monks.
Oh, okay.
And so she reintroduces the relationship between the Cluniacs and the emperors again. He ends up spending at least the first part of his reign in dealing with events happening in Hungary and Bohemia. And there are a number of internal disputes that take place, too. And so he's going to be concentrating, the first part of his reign is going to be concentrating mainly in Germany itself. And as we've seen over and over again, when the German kings and emperors are not paying attention to Rome, the Roman families come in, and this is when they have their little fun.
Mm-hmm.
One of these is going to be this young boy, Benedict IX. He is placed on the throne of Peter through the efforts and bribery of his father. He is elected pope at the age of 12.
Mm-hmm.
You know, well, what can I say?
Right,
Eventually the people of Rome themselves were so disgusted by this that they rose up in rebellion, and in 1044 he had to flee Rome. The Roman mob now took things into their own hands, and they elevated the Bishop of Sabina as their pope. Now, obviously, he's an anti-pope,
right?
And he should never have accepted it, but he did. And he chose the title Sylvester III. Okay, but he's an anti-pope.
Mm-hmm.
So now you've got a legitimate pope who is terrible,
right?
Living outside of Rome in a castle someplace, and now you've got an illegitimate pope, an anti-pope, who is propped up by the Roman mob, and in all of this, there is a holy priest in Rome, and there's some question as to his relationship to Pope Benedict. It's believed that he could be the godfather of Pope Benedict. We're not real sure of that. Some historians have claimed that, but there's no real paper trail on that or not. His name is Father John Gratian. And he is, as I say, a holy man, an archpriest of the Diocese of Rome. He has been a tutor to several other reform-minded people, and ultimately he sees an answer. And his answer is, obviously, it's not this guy that's been propped up, as Sylvester III. And what he does instead is he goes out of Rome and he goes to Benedict, and he says to Benedict, he says, "Now, you really don't want to be pope, do you?" And Benedict goes, "Well, no, it was my dad's idea. I really don't." And he says, "I don't know what I can do about it." And Father Gratian says, "I'll tell you what, you could abdicate. You can do that. There have been popes that have abdicated, and we can get this thing, straightened out." And Benedict's response was, remember, he's a young man, he's in his 20s, and he says, "Oh yeah, well, that's real nice, but what am I going to do the rest of my life?" And Father Gratian makes a suggestion, and it's going to be his undoing. He says, "I'll tell you what, if we came up with a good severance package for you,
okay,
would you retire?" And he goes, "Well, if it's good enough, yeah, I probably will." And he said, "I think I could probably persuade whoever the next pope is going to be to give you a severance package. We'll give you next year's Peter's Pence worldwide collection, and you can go ahead and go off and have a good old time." And Gregory goes, "Ooh, that sounds nice. Yes, I'll do that." And so he abdicated.
Okay.
Father Gratian then goes back to Rome, gathers the priests together, and says, "Pope Benedict has abdicated. He is no longer pope. This Sylvester fellow is not pope. We all know that. The mob made him pope. now we can elect, as the priests of Rome, we can elect a new bishop. And they did. Father Gratian.
No.
And so he then becomes Pope. He accepts the position, takes the title Pope Gregory VI, and then does exactly as he promised. He then takes the Peter's Pence for that year and gives that to the former Pope Benedict as a retirement package. And he is absolutely hailed by all the reformers of the church. Over in one of the monasteries in Gombio, Saint Peter Damian cries out when he hears that Father Gratian has been elected Pope. He cries out, "The dove has returned to the ark with an olive branch." Everyone's so excited about this. And Pope Gregory then begins calling together the best reformers that he can. And one of those is a young man who has come to Rome to study. His name is Hildebrand of Siena. And he is, and once again, historians have differed as to whether or not one of the men he had studied under was none other than Father Gratian. It depends on the historians. We're not real sure of that yet. But anyhow, Hildebrand comes and he becomes a secretary for Pope Gregory. Others the same way. In 1046, Emperor Henry III comes to Italy in order to help this Reformation. As Henry is coming into Italy, he looks around and he sees three people claiming to be Pope. He sees Gregory, who's just been elected by the priests of Rome. He sees Sylvester, who has been acclaimed by the people of Rome, although it's a mob. Okay. And then he sees Benedict, who now has decided that his retirement package wasn't good enough, and he's claiming that he actually didn't abdicate. So things are a mess. And so as he comes to Rome, he's greeted at the city of Piacenza by Gregory the Sixth. And Gregory the Sixth has a request for him. And the number one thing is to bring troops to the city of Rome in order to restore law and order to the city itself, because there's no militia, there's no police force, and basically there's a whole bunch of brigands who are operating in and out of the city of Rome, and what they do is they attack and rob pilgrims who are trying to come to Rome. And so he says, the first thing you got to do, you got to clean this thing up. And there were too many murders. There were murders every day in Rome. It was just a lawless city. And so Gregory says, please do that. And Henry says, I'll certainly do that. But also I want to get to the bottom of this. I mean, there are three of you running around saying that you're Pope. I want to figure out who it is. And he says, we need to have a conference, a council. And Gregory says, yes. Let's get to the bottom of this. I mean, he's got nothing to fear, he thinks. And so it's called for the city of Sutri. It's a little village of Sutri. And it's going to decide who the anti-popes are and who the real pope is. And all three of these popes are to appear before the emperor. And Gregory is led to believe that it's Gregory who will make the decision. Okay? Well, anyhow, the council is set for the 20th of December, 1046. Even before the council assembles, word comes from Sylvester III saying, I'm not the Pope. I was put up by this crowd. Please let me go home to become bishop of my diocese again. And word comes from Gregory, and word comes from Henry, the emperor, and basically it's, yes, fine, go home and we'll solve that. Benedict IX, ain't no way I'm coming there. I'm Pope, but I'm not coming there. And then he sends some informers to the emperor and says, oh, by the way, when you get a chance, ask Gregory how he became Pope. and ask him about Peter's pence.
Mm-hmm.
And so the emperor goes, what is this? What's this about? And he goes, well, it's the only way I could get him to resign was to tell him that we would give him a severance package. And then Henry goes, oh, let me see if I understand this correctly. You gave away next year's collection of the Peter's pence, and you became Pope? Sounds like simony.
Mm-hmm.
And Gregory goes, that's not simony. I wasn't Pope at the time. He goes, looks awful bad. And so what happens is there's a little meeting, and we don't know. It's a private meeting between the emperor and the Pope. And all we know is that at the end of that meeting, Gregory abdicated. Gregory VI abdicated. And he then was taken to Germany, where he spent the remainder of his life. We're not really sure even where. There's a legend that he's buried in Bingham on the Rhine River, and that might be. We don't know, but it's a very sad end to a wonderful man
mm-hmm.
who had tried to do the right thing
Right.
and had been caught up in this sort of like Enron scandal
Yes,
kind of a deal.
yeah.
And of course, in the end, it's that evil Benedict who, is off on the side laughing his head off because he's ruined a perfectly good priest and a good pope, and now this man's up there. The one person that saw the irony of this whole thing was Hildebrand. And Hildebrand of Sueno, rather than staying in Rome, he went to Germany, and he accompanied Gregory.
Oh.
And when Gregory died, he then left and went to Cluny to become a monk at Cluny. And there he intended to spend the rest of his life.
Wow.
This Council of Sutri is just such a shame, such a disaster. And Henry now, the Emperor Henry III, he's now gotten one anti-pope to go back to become bishop of his diocese, Sabina, and now the other Henry VI is now in retirement, having abdicated, is now in retirement up in Germany, and now Benedict is in hiding. Benedict IX is afraid of what could happen next, and Henry then goes to Rome, and now Rome is popeless, and so he then gathers the priests together, and he suggests a name. Well, what are you going to do? And so the priests, whatever, you're emperor, you name him, and it's the Bishop of Bamberg, who had come with Henry down to Rome. His name is Msgr of Mordesleben Horenburg. He is a German. And he's not real happy about this. He loved Bamberg. He had no intention. I mean, he went to Rome at the request of the emperor, but he had no intention of staying. And there he is, elected, and he takes the title Pope Clement II. And he then returns the favor to King Henry and crowns him Holy Roman Emperor, Patricius Romanorum, the protector of the Romans. And the one Roman he needed protection of more than anybody else was the Pope himself, because Clement knew that there were bad things sitting right in front of him. I mean, they were all around him, surrounded like bees, as they say in the Psalms, and he never left the emperor's side. Everywhere the emperor went, he went, because he just didn't trust anybody, and rightly so. On October 9th of 1047, he was poisoned. He was Pope less than 9 months. There are two interesting things about his papacy, although it's very brief, that are worthy of note. And one is that while he was Pope, he called together all of the priests and bishops of his diocese, and all of those who had been involved in simony He required them to do 40 days of penance, fasting and penance, and at the end of those 40 days, they would then be restored to their positions. So he forgave them. He recognized the legitimacy and the validity of their ordinations, although they were achieved in that particular way. But they were recognized, and this becomes a pattern later on for other reforming popes, and especially Pope Leo, that we'll talk about in a little while. But that's one of the things. The other thing is, in the process of being Pope, being Bishop of Rome, he never got around to abdicating as Bishop of Bamberg.
Oh.
And so he was bishop of two dioceses at the same time. Now, later on, that's going to be a very interesting practice, not necessarily for the Pope, but for other bishops. But in this particular moment, it's I guess he always kind of secretly hoped
that he
could
home?
Go home. He used to refer to the Diocese of Bamberg as my sweetest bride.
Oh.
He was always homesick. Of course, he only lived 9 months. And when he died, he got his wish. His body was transported back to Bamberg, where he's presently buried.
Wow.
Even to this day, he is the only pope buried in Germany, with the exception of Gregory VI, but we don't know where Gregory VI is buried. I have my own hunch. I think I know where he's buried.
Really?
But yeah, there's a cemetery in Bingen, and I don't know. I mean, I was there some years back, and I could almost feel his presence. I'm just making this up. But no, I'm not making it up.
I don't think so. I do.
Yeah, but I have a hunch that he's buried in an unmarked grave in that particular cemetery, and we'll know, I guess, at the final judgment. But anyhow, so poor Pope Clement died, and Henry then says, well, we need another pope, and he turns around to another bishop from Germany. This is Bishop Popone of Brixen. And he said, how about you? And the bishop says, well, I don't know. And so he turns to the priest of the diocese of Rome, and he says, I've got another candidate here. And they go, oh, whatever. And so they elect him, Bishop Popone, as bishop. He takes the title Damasus II. He is pope for 23 days.
Oh, man.
And this was during the summertime. It depends again on the historians. Some will say that he died of the summer heat, which can be horrible in Rome. And remember, back in those days, they didn't dress accordingly. So it's possible he could have suffered sunstroke. They also believe that malaria was going. That's a possibility. The other possibility is some of the symptoms also point to poisoning. So any of those could have been possibilities. Anyway, he dies. 23 days later, Henry is still in Italy, turns around to the bishops, the German bishops who are with him, and says, well, who would like to be pope?
Like, no, thank you.
That's exactly right. There were no takers. Nobody. And so at this point, he has to go outside of his own entourage, and he calls in a man that he had the highest regard for, a relative, and he was the Bishop of Toul, which is in Alsace, and which is that territory presently in France, but it's always been contested whether it's French or German. Anyway, his name is Bruno, Bishop Bruno of Toul, and he said, we'd like you to come down and become Pope. And so he does. He comes down. Now here is Teresa, here is the confluence. Here is where all the graces come together in this Bishop Bruno of Toul. This is where all the wonderful stuff that was done for centuries now, for over 100 years, by the holy monks of Cluny. You have the devout laymen and saints, kings and queens of the Holy Roman Empire. Henry III is never canonized. He's not considered to be a saint. Probably because of what he did to Gregory VI, but nonetheless, he thinks he's doing the best. But all of this comes together at this particular moment. The prayers of millions of Catholics all throughout the world for the reformation of their church. All of this comes together in Bishop Bruno of Toul, who goes down to Rome and takes the title Leo the Ninth. He is going to be a canonized saint. The last time there was a pope who was a canonized saint was in 867 A.D.
Wow.
And this was Saint Nicholas the First.
Yeah.
And I sort of skipped over Nicholas the First, promising when we were covering that period, promising we would talk about him. I want to talk about him now because Leo the Ninth, his vision of the papacy and its role and ministry to the universal church is exactly the same as the vision of Nicholas the First, who is in history known as Nicholas the Great. There are only 3 popes who have been called great so far. Leo the First, Gregory the First, and Nicholas the First. So far. And the last time there had been a canonized pope was Nicholas the First, and the next time is going to be Leo the Ninth. It would be Saint Leo the Ninth, and he models his papacy upon Nicholas. So let's talk a little bit about Nicholas. He is pope from 858 to 867, basically about 9 years, and this is that period of time when you've got the Carolingian meltdown, you've got the raids by the Saracens and the Magyars and the Vikings. Feudalism is developing itself into a self-defense mechanism. And at that particular moment, one historian, Walter Ullmann, says the following. He says, the entire social and religious system of the world is dependent upon the papacy of Rome. This is how Nicholas I visualized the role of the institution and he ruled in that spirit. And this is what we have. In the life of the 9 years that Nicholas I, this is the reason why he's called great, is because during his time, he patched up royal marriages. I mean, things were pretty riotous, and he patched those things up. He broke up incestuous relationships within the imperial family itself. He was able to bring the bishops back away from their own nationalist tendencies. He was able to exert control and authority over archbishops. There's a famous example in which the Archbishop of Rheims, one of the most important dioceses in France, removed a bishop, one of his suffragans, just simply removed him. For whatever reason, without papal authority. And Nicholas I came in and said, you can't do that. You come to me. I gave that man the papal mandate, the apostolic mandate. Only I can rescind that. And the Archbishop of Rheims backed off. So this was an important sign of that. He forced the emperors not to meddle in ecclesial affairs. Even the emperor, the Byzantine emperor, there was a big crisis over the archdiocese of Ravenna, and he was able to exert his influence there. He is responsible for the evangelization of Eastern Europe.
Wow.
I mean, we're talking, Poland and Hungary and Bohemia and Slovakia, Bulgaria. He's responsible for all of that, and he also is able to patch up, at least for a while, the relationship between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. There are times of schism, and he's able to patch that up. Wow. He does all of this, wow. And he's able to do it because he sees the role of the Pope as the chief moral arbiter in the world, not of the world, but in the world. Now, it's sad to say that the next 4six popes were not able to come up to that standard. Mm-hmm. Some of them were good men, mm-hmm. but many of them were not. And some of them were good men living in times when they were not able to do because the times were bad. Mm-hmm. But after 46 popes, you sorely need a reforming pope who's going to challenge feudalism, and especially in the areas of simony and clerical concubinage. And here we have now the Bishop of Toul going to Rome to do that very thing. Bruno was born in 1002. 1002. He was the son of a German count, Count Hugo of Igesheim, and a priest. He was in the entourage of the emperor, and for a short while he had served as a canon in the city of Toul, which is a relatively small diocese, and like I say, between Germany and France. And when the Bishop of Toul died, the people and the priests of Toul gathered together and sent him an offer asking him to become the Bishop of Toul. And he accepted. The emperor had told him, do not accept.
Oh.
And the reason for that was that he believed that Bruno should be the bishop of a much more important diocese. Toul was just too small. It was a little backwater place. But he defied the emperor. He went to Toul, became the bishop of Toul, and then began to reform the city, the diocese, his diocese. And he did this especially working in very close connection with a local monastery there that had reformed itself, once again, through the Cluniac reforms. And so here we have the bishop and the monks working hand in glove in order to reform their little diocese. The people are coming along. They love this. They're returning to the faith, the practice of the faith. And then all of a sudden, disaster hits. The Count of Champagne decides he's going to invade and take over. And the people were defenseless. And they turned to the bishop and said, help us. Do something. Well, remember his former life was as chaplain for the emperor. Mm-hmm. He picked up some military science in the process. And so he put together the militia of Toul, and he fortified the city so that when the Count of Champagne attacked, he was defeated. And everyone looked, of course, to the bishop, to having saved them. He increased the devotion to Saint Gerard, who was a previous bishop of that diocese, often led people on pilgrimages to Rome. And so there was this connection between this little tiny diocese and Rome itself, even in the midst of all these bad popes, even in the midst of all these brigands. You know, this bishop Bishop Bruno would bring people down to Rome, and for pilgrimages. He was a wonderful negotiator in that region. Many times, warring factions would turn to him to act as the arbitrator and to bring about peace. So in February of 1049, here Bishop Bruno of Toul arrives in Rome. His last couple predecessors were also Germans, and they were dead. They did not last long. Mm-hmm. And he arrives as the candidate of the Emperor Henry III, and when the priests of Rome gathered together for the election, they were not a happy group of campers. Here's another German. But the difference is they knew this guy because he had come often on pilgrimage. And they were waiting to receive him, but not real happy about it. And when he appeared before them, he was not dressed in all kinds of falderal. He was dressed as a pilgrim. Very simple robes. And he met with them, and he said, I know you are not happy to have another German as your pope. I understand. And if you do not want me as pope, tell me now, and I'll defy the emperor, and I'll go back to Toul. I'm on your side. No emperor should be coming in telling you who the pope ought to be. It's your diocese. You elect the right man. Immediately, unanimously, they elected him. Within 2 months, he formed a synod at the Lateran in order to reform Rome the same way he had done in Toul. And he then applies the same Reformation. It kind of reminds me of Cardinal Wojtyła in Krakow. After the Second Vatican Council, he goes back and he reforms the Diocese of Krakow based upon the Second Vatican Council documents. And then later, of course, he's elected John Paul II, and he applies that same reform of the Second Vatican Council to the Universal Church. And so, in a sense, it's sort of an experiment. It's done in the diocese. So he does the same thing. St. Peter Damian is sitting over in his monastery, and he has written this really scathing book. It's entitled Gomorrhianos, The Diversity of Crimes Against Nature, in which he talks about what life was like, religious life was like in Rome. And now Pope Leo IX gets a copy of this, and he reads this in order to know exactly how bad things really are. And so that becomes the grist of that synod that takes place at the Lateran. Leo then invites in certain other people to come and to be with him and to help reform the church. And the first thing he does is he sends word to the monastery at Cluny, and he says to Hildebrand, "Come back, I need you." And Hildebrand leaves Cluny and then came back to act as archdeacon and to serve Pope Leo IX. He then also sends word up to this little monastery I had mentioned up near Toul that had helped reform the diocese up there. It's called Moyen-Moutier, and he takes one of the monks out of there, a man by the name of Humbert, and he brings him down to Rome also. It's sort of a papal kitchen cabinet he's forming. Another priest, also a great intellect of the day, Friedrich of Liège. He's brought down also, and then made abbot of Monte Cassino. Wow. He's also the brother of the Duke of Lorraine, so he's well connected. And later on, he himself will become a pope. Abbot Peter Damian, who has been spending his time as the abbot of Gumbio, writing books and making sermons and critiquing what's going on in Rome. The Pope turns around and says, "You, come here. I need you." Yeah, and so he makes him the Cardinal Archbishop of Ostia, which is like the president of the of the cardinals. Interestingly enough, none of these men are Roman. All of them come from someplace else throughout the Catholic world. And Leo himself spends most of his time out of Rome. He's reforming the Universal Church. Every year he has a synod in Rome. He always spends Easter in Rome. And then after that he travels. I think probably next to John Paul II, he's got more frequent flyer miles than anybody, you know. In 1049, he has the council at Rome. Then he leaves, goes to Pavia. Then he goes up into France to Rheims, and then to Mayence. I'll say some more things about some of these synods in a couple minutes. In 1050, the next year, has a synod in Rome. Then he goes to Salerno, Ponto, Vercelli, in Rome in 1051, another synod. Then he goes off to Mantua in 1053, another synod in 1050. So he's constantly calling these synods, always calling these bishops together. And in many cases, rather than bringing them to Rome, he goes to them. Yeah. And in every case, he uses the formula of Pope Clement II, that 40 days of penance. He gathers these bishops together and says, okay, I know that many of you got your positions through simony. It was, you bought your positions. Okay, understand that. If you're willing to do 40 days of penance, we'll put it all behind us and we'll go on from there. And time after time, bishops rallied and do that, but not all of them. Some of them are quite defiant. In Rheims, for example, when he went to consecrate the church of Saint-Remy, it's a beautiful old medieval church, and he goes there and he calls an assembly of all the bishops, and everyone knows what it's all about. And when he assembles these bishops there, a lot of them are missing. And the reason is that the king of France knows exactly what he's doing, And he called a council back in Paris the same time that the Council of Reims was. And so many of the Simoniac bishops went to Paris rather than Reims so they wouldn't be confronted by the Pope. And so simony is not entirely solved in France yet after that council. Goes to Germany, to Mainz, brings in all the bishops there right in front of the emperor and demands the same 40 days of penance. And most of them did. When he went to Mantua, he gathers all of these Italian bishops together. He tells them what he wants. They are so upset that they actually threw him into a room and barricaded the room. And for several hours, the Pope was held captive by these angry bishops. And finally, cooler heads prevailed. They unbarricaded the door and came out and said, "Deal still open for 40 days?" And he goes, "Yes." And so many of them came over to his side then.
Oh my gosh.
Everywhere he went, he insisted that the canons of the various dioceses would not receive gifts for having elected the bishops. This was even in Rome. You remember it's typical that when the cardinals elect. This is all before cardinals and the College of Cardinals, but
Right.
Even before that, and even to this day, remember that the new pope always gives a banquet to the cardinals.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is a remnant, a leftover of what had been a practice that that Pope Leo saw as being simoniac.
Okay.
In that. That gifts would be given to the electors of these various bishops. And so he said, you can't do that anymore. It looks too much like simony. And you cannot charge for funerals. They were actually charging. There were fees set for charging for funerals, for Mass. And I'm not talking about Mass stipends, intentions and all that. I'm talking about priests saying, I won't say Mass for anything under $40 a Mass.
Uh-huh.
Well, you can't do that. So he got rid of all of that. The anointing of the sick. Could you imagine?
No.
They were expected to be paid to anoint the sick. And he goes, "No, we're not doing that anymore." And they go, "Well, where do we make our income? How do we survive? We got to live too." And says, "Okay." And he sets up a whole series of rules in which the priest would be paid through various things, like the little Mass stipends and things of that nature. It is so that they have an income, but they could not charge for sacraments. And so this is part of the reform that breaking down of simony that's going to happen. Saint Pope Leo reforms the church, and he does from the top down. He's an example for many others many of later popes are not going to be successful in this top-down reformation. And a lot of it has to do with personalities and whether the church is ready for it and whatever else. But he's going to do a lot of reforming for the church. His successors are going to continue the Reformation. It's not going to be easy. There are going to be setbacks. But as we see in the next couple programs, these reformers, and especially that kitchen cabinet of his, is going to continue this Reformation even after his own death. And we have time to talk about how he died. There are two disasters that happened in his papacy, and neither of which have anything to do with him. One of those is going to be the great schism that happens between the East and the West, and he's going to be on his deathbed when that happens. He's going to send over the best people, he thinks, to be able to work with the Eastern Church. Unfortunately, you've got a patriarch over there who is hell-bent on schism, and it gets his way. We'll talk about that later on. It's a very sad moment in church history, and everyone thought it would reconcile itself in a couple years, and it just never did. No. And even to this day, we grapple with ways to
still struggle with it.
Yeah, we do. We still struggle with it. But anyway, that happens at the end of his papacy. The other thing that happened at the end of his papacy, the last year or two of his papacy, was a disaster in southern Italy, and it's brought about by the Normans. Now, Normans are, they're descendants of the Vikings, and the Normans settled in Normandy,
that's right.
right? And it's called Normandy because they're Norsemen who are doing this. So they're tremendous fighters, and in some cases they get hired up as mercenaries. And there's a whole troop of these Normans who are hired to go and fight in Sicily and southern Italy. And when they get there, they find that they're so good, instead of fighting for other people, they start fighting for themselves. One of the first things they're going to do is they're going to clean Sicily out of Saracen rule. Now, they'll continue being Muslims living in Sicily, but they no longer rule Sicily. The Norman knights are going to control Sicily. The downside of that is that the Christians are going to be controlled by them too. When they take over everything, and that's including the churches and the monasteries. And then they moved into southern Italy, and they'll do the same thing in southern Italy. They're going to run out the Saracen control, but then they're going to turn around and run out the Byzantine control too. And they're simply going to take over everything for themselves. And Pope Leo is constantly going to appeal to them, saying, stop this, you can't do this. You know, you're just, all we're doing is just exchanging one form of control for another. The monasteries have to be independent. The dioceses have to be independent. The bishops have to be independent. And these Normans are, you know, they're just like those Franks. If I build it, it's mine. Or if I conquer it, it's mine. And so they also ignore the Pope. And people appeal to Pope Leo for help. Leo then turns around to the Emperor, Henry III, and says, we need your help. And Henry III, who has done so much, says, I'm too busy, can't come. I'll send you an army. He says, okay, anything can help. He sends 700 soldiers. That was it. It was a bunch of Schwäbisch knights, southwestern Germany, the area of Baden-Württemberg today. And these knights march down, and they become the core of a papal army that is supposedly going to march down into this Norman territory and confront these Normans who were just, you know...
paid fighters.
Yeah. So he gets some Roman volunteers. He gets some people from Benevento who join him. He's got his 700 German knights. They all go marching down, and he, you know, Leo thinks to himself, well, I did it in Toul. Well, he was fighting the Count of Champagne there. It wasn't, you know, not quite the same thing. And sure enough, it takes one battle, the Battle of Civitate, and it's a disaster. All of those volunteers run. He is surrounded. The knights, the 700 Schwäbisch knights, die to a man protecting him. And in the end, he's taken captive, and brought to Benevento by the Normans. And by January of 1054, he is a very, very sick man. He's not able to keep any food down. He's wasting away. And the Normans are thinking, like, what are we going to do with this guy? And he said to the Normans, he said, allow me to go back to Rome to die. And they turn around, these Normans, and they put together an honor guard.
Oh my God.
Isn't this bizarre? And
this is bizarre.
Yes. And they honor guard. They bring him back to Rome, to the old St. Peter's, where he then went to confession, was anointed, and spent the next several days praying in St. Peter's with his coffin at his side. And that's kind of morbid, but you know. And anyway, on April 19th of 1054, he went to Mass, attended Mass, received viaticum, and later that afternoon died, very quietly. The Normans stayed on as defenders of the papacy.
Oh, no.
And believe it or not, they're going to play an incredibly important role as defenders of the Pope after having done what they did. This is kind of bizarre.
Okay.
Pope St. Leo the Ninth is not going to live long enough to see the second tragedy. He'll die without knowing that his mission to Constantinople was not successful. He will be succeeded by other reforming popes. The papacy, there are other moments when anti-reform groups are going to try to take over the papacy again, but ultimately Leo has set in stone the vision of St. Nicholas the Great, and there are men who are going to follow behind as popes, who are going to constantly battle to see that vision through. And the vision is, we should never forget this vision is to live out Matthew 16. Thou art Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. He's given the keys of the kingdom, not to rule over people, but to call the church to unity, and to holiness. And that's what this is all supposed to be about. Although not every occupant of the chair of Peter is going to be able to live that out or even want to live that out. That's going to be the ideal. And St. Leo the Ninth is one of these examples of someone who gives his life to do that very thing. Yeah.
What a life.
What a life, yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, Father, thank you so much. We got Nicholas and Leo in there. We got both greats in this,
yes,
program.
Leo the Ninth is not considered.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, you're right.
Great.
I'm sorry. You're right.
He's pretty great, but he's not the great.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Shall we close today?
Let's do. Okay. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.